Any society and its progress is driven by what we call the acquisition of knowledge. India has traditionally been known to be a knowledge powerhouse. Increasingly today, we are converting this knowledge powerhouse into economic capital too. I think anything that builds itself on knowledge, anything that builds itself on innovation emerging out of this knowledge, anything that builds itself on defining the nationalistic framework for which this knowledge and innovation can be used, will lead to the progress and growth of not just our country, but we can become the model for the rest of this world. And that is where the skin talks, or talks based on knowledge, innovation and nationalism, becomes extremely critical. The development model I am going to talk about and the philosophy I subscribe to is all built on this foundational appreciation and understanding of knowledge, innovation and nationalism. Midway in my journey of living with tribals, maybe 15-20 years ago, I was at a point in life where I believed access to health care, access to education, having schools, hospitals, roads, toilets, child care and care for pregnant women was development. While I am not saying those are not important components of development, I had come to believe that is what development is all about. One incident changed my understanding and appreciation of development. As a consultant to the World Bank, I had an opportunity to visit a very remote district called Sahibganj in one corner of Jharkhand, mostly populated by Paharia tribals. And what I saw there made me think about what development meant and how development is different for different people and what the perspectives of development could be. I remember traveling the whole day. There was no access to any food of any kind for me. There was no IB where I could stay. Possibly the only vehicle that was going around the roads was the car that the government had provided me. And I went into this tribal area and I found an young woman of 26-27 years. Maybe she looked 40, but she was around 25-26, cooking. And what I saw in a small hut were 6 children around her, one on her hip, 3 playing outside, one lying down on the floor, and she was pregnant also. And the first thought as a physician was, oh my God, 6 children, and what a challenge. Why couldn't she stop with just 1 or 2 children? We are trained to think based on the paradigm of our own competence. Very rarely we are challenged to think outside the zones of our competence. And here I was coming with a solution framework for this young lady and how she could have got out of poverty if only she had just 1 or 2 children. And that's what we are trained to think. In the course of the conversation, as I started talking to her, I asked her what she was preparing. She was preparing a very dilute, watery form of what we could call sambar. It was nothing but hot water and chili and a lot of stuff which looked like grass to me thrown inside. And she had gone out and plucked a little bit of what she thought was greens, but to me was looking more like crude grass, and boiling it. And she said she wouldn't feed that to her children because that would cause bleeding, and maybe it was causing ulceration of the mucosal lining, and so the children would bleed. And so she said she would want to possibly breastfeed most of her children. At least the last 3 children of hers she was breastfeeding. In the course of the conversation, what she told me, she never seemed to be perturbed by poverty. She never seemed to be worried that she had no food to eat. She was very happy, very comfortable, and in a sense very equanimous with life. And she was absolutely undisturbed that I was the one who was disturbed by her poverty. I was the one who was disturbed by the fact she had 6 children and that children would be eating something which they should not be eating. I was the one who was calculating the nutritive content of the meal and stuff like that. And what that lady told me changed my life. She said she was not having children because she wanted to have children. She found that the best solution for feeding her babies. She said every time I become pregnant and then I start lactating, which meant more milk available to the rest of the children. So her reason to have babies was to make sure she was lactating long enough to feed all her children. Now this is India, this is real India. What would development mean to this woman? Would development mean what I had learnt as traditionally as development, or something else? And the same day, within 2 hours after that, I went into another tribal house. A very elderly man was sitting and having his lunch, and I was hoping to share his lunch. His lunch was his family's lunch, not his lunch. The 6 people are waiting to eat around him. They had 1 aluminium crumbled plate in front of them with 4 thick rotis, 2 onions and 2 chilies. And this was lunch for them, for the 6 of them. And here we are talking of tribal development. Here I am representing a bank which is supposed to elevate global poverty. Here I am coming on behalf of a country or a state which is looking at spending crores of rupees, millions of dollars on what we call elevation of poverty and development. and we are not even sure what human development is all about. These questions started getting me to refocus and rethink. It left me so disturbed, I decided to get away from it all, took a break, took a sabbatical, and in my journey of walking around India, walking around Karnataka, spending time at Sabarmati Ashram, and maybe a year at Harvard, where I thought, let me learn what the Western world thinks of development, I started shaping what I believe is what development needs to be for India. And I look at it as development which is culturally appropriate, which is contextually relevant. And what do I mean by that? Before I get into it, I would like to describe what development should be. Like I said, development is not economic growth. If we can read the recent report that Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen brought out for the French government called Mismeasuring Our Lives, GDP is a very inadequate and incomplete measurement of what human progress can be. And I fully subscribe to that. What I believe development is, to me, development is a constant expansion of human capability. If we can constantly look at how do we expand capability of people, students, young people, politicians, everybody who matters for development, that is truly development. And these can manifest in many ways. This expansion of human capability can manifest as a set of enormous securities. It could manifest as social securities, economic securities, food security, language security, political security, social security, all kinds of securities. These are all manifestations of development, but they are not development. And without building this essential human capability, I don't think we can change the lives of people, whether it's India or outside. And for that, we need to understand India. We need to look at history, because in this mad rush for aping the Western models of development, the last 60-65 years, what we have done in this country is brought in all the modern imitations which are absolutely irrelevant. These are all isomorphic mimicries that we have been creating, which don't really suit the Indian context. I'm not romanticist trying to romanticize what India is, but let's look at the cultural fabric, the cultural DNA of India. Because change is not about change. Change is about understanding what to preserve. And we need to look at various things that our country has. We had a lot of things which are not good. Like Vivekananda said, we need to address them. But there are a lot of things which are very, very good, and we need to retain and preserve them. If you look at India and its strength, even if you look at it economically, the way people understand growth and development today, till maybe the 16th century, along with China and the Chinese civilization, India contributed close to 40% of global GDP. Till the 1800s, maybe 20% of global trade came from India. Something that happened in the last 200-250 years that has changed the equations today. Look at India today. What kind of a country have we built? We have a nation today where even now 54% of our children less than 5 years are malnourished. The more important thing is they don't have to be so. 74% of women in rural areas are anemic, anemia because of iron deficiency. 10 rupees a year can solve it for them, but they don't have to be anemic. With all the advancements of science and technology, close to 60% of Indians can't access a toilet, and nearly 50% of Indians don't have access to safe drinking water. Now, like I said, these are all manifestations of growing human capacity, but if you're not building capacities to address these issues, what kind of a development are you talking? My concern is, can we look at a model which can build on the foundational philosophy of India and the cultural DNA that we have, look at this development being contextually relevant, which addresses different contexts across India. We must understand India is an extremely diverse country. What might work for a village in Mysore may not work for Sahibganj district in Jharkhand or for Rajasthan or for Chennai. We need to look at each area being different. We need to possibly disaggregate this country based on its diversity, based on the human skills required, and that is the kind of development framework that I would like to talk about. And in this context, to me, there is no single player who can take responsibility for development. I believe the state, and if you can call it the government, whether it's the government of India or the government of each individual state government, are the principal drivers of development by the sheer fact that they are permanent institutions. I only see two permanent institutions. One is the government and the other is the community for whom all of us exist. Now, the government is populated for members of this community, and the government exists for serving the community. Now, in the Indian context, the constitution mandates that the state does everything for its citizens. I see the Indian constitution as one of the finest written documents ever conceived by the human brain. The tragedy is we have forgotten it for 65 years. We just let it go by. Now, if we can look at it as a social re-engineering tool and adhere to the principles that our founding fathers gave us, that is the beginning of change and development for this country. And who are the major players beyond the state and the citizenry or the community? I see two other players. The two other players to me are the NGO sector, a sector which emerged very strongly in the 60s and grew rapidly in the 80s, a sector which is not really fully understood its potential, a sector which employs the largest number of people in the country today, and a sector which unfortunately is transitioning because of various pressures. Now, this is the critical sector which can join hands with the state in ensuring services reach the people. Post 91, the post liberalization era, the globalization, privatization era, we have the corporate world which is growing. And for long, I had a different view. I believed that anything corporate is dirty. I think thankfully I've changed my views based on evidence. And today I believe every one of these four players, whether it is government, the citizenry, the not-for-profit civil society sector or the corporate sector, each of us have a role to play. Now, developing a synergistic partnership, understanding what role each one can play, understanding the strengths, understanding the limitations of the sector, learning to work with each other, combining them all together is what development can it truly be development for this country, and we need to look at whether can we do that. And to me, that can happen only when you understand traditional India, because India was not just looking at economic capital all the time. For a long time, for thousands of years, India also had two other issues in mind which it addressed. I know the social caste system was a challenge for this country and that had to be taken care of, and we need to address it even today, and constitutionally we have begun that process. But the two things that we focused on beyond economic capital, which makes India unique and special and a model to the rest of the world, was our focus on human capital, where for long we believed the pursuit of individual evolution was the purpose of life itself. So we always believed that spiritual evolution is far higher and intensely personal though, but it could be collective wise for society itself, and this search for excellence within the human self, I think that is the beginning of the search for building this and strengthening this human capital, and that is what India was known for. And why build human capital? Indian philosophy was very clear. We built it for the sake of humanity, and that is why we stood up. And for us, global leadership did not mean global supremacy in terms of power and defense equipment. It meant a concern for humanity, and that is where the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam came from us. We really believe that we are responsible for this whole world. The very concept of sustainability, the very concept of caring for other things, building an ecosystem, having a systems approach to development is foundationally ingrained in the Indian thinking, and that is what we have lost. We don't see the systems view of development at all. We don't take the multidimensionality of development. We have now started to focus it very unidimensionally on just income growth, per capita growth and GDP growth. I think that's a very incomplete assessment of human progress and development. The third capital which India culturally had and we are losing today is our socio-cultural capital. Now, in short, maybe the social capital, the fabric of our family life, the fabric of our societal life, the fabric of we being concerned for each other, or what the statements in the Mahabharata like, you sacrifice your family for the sake of the village, and the village for the sake of the kingdom and stuff like that, where the fundamental interrelationship of mankind, the principle of interdependence and reciprocity, which is today being admired, was part of our DNA for long, which has now got away for the last 60 years. So to quickly summarize, what I believe is development now needs to be, we need to look at development not just as income growth and all these things, but beyond that as a constant expansion of human capability. We need to understand that government alone cannot be the player driving this development, and development has to be a synergistic partnership between the four major players: communities and citizens for whom all of us exist, the state which leads development because it's constitutionally mandated, corporate world because they have to be socially responsible and many of them are, and the civil society which is now filling in the gaps wherever deficits are. But building partnerships are not easy. We need to appreciate that we are all trained the last 50-60 years based on expanding the trust deficit amongst us. Now that is a flawed way of looking at it. Simple thing, I go out of the campus today, I hire an auto rickshaw to travel back somewhere. The first thought that crosses my mind is, will this auto driver, could this guy have doctored his meter? I don't trust him, I always mistrust him. I always worry about that he's going to cheat me. Or I go buy some fruits from a street vendor. The first thought that comes to my mind is, will his scale be okay? Will he cheat me out of the fruit that I'm buying? So we are all trained constantly to mistrust. Now I think we need to retrain ourselves to trust everybody and reduce the trust deficit amongst us. All partnerships have to be based on four very fundamental things, what I call the 4 R's. We need to understand that we need to share resources. We need to understand that there are risks involved in partnerships. Now I may not agree with government and their ideology, but then there are risks involved. I have to partner with them. then we need to understand that we need to share responsibilities. We simply can't say government will do everything for us. Every private citizen has a role in rebuilding India, rebuilding this world, and that responsibility has to be shared. And finally, when things are better, we can't end up saying, I did it. I think this is the strength of Indian philosophy, where the space for I was never there. It was always we. And so if we can understand Indian culture and philosophy, we'll always say we did it. And the spirit of sharing rewards, which is ingrained in us, in stories, in our Puranas, in our Vedic scriptures, is something we got to start living every day now. So we have had all this taught to us over time. Today we believe development needs a special kind of leadership. A leadership that is not looking at just technical expertise, a leadership which is driven by what today's assessment tells us 5 major qualities in leaders. The first is faith. Faith in these processes. Faith in the fact we can change. We can really bring about human progress in a constructive, positive way. And the second is this desire to be different. The purpose, having higher purpose, this desire to create a vision. Vision again not just for India but for the whole world. And this is where I believe the vision that Vivekananda gave us, a vision of a united India standing up and being the world leader. And when he meant world leader, he didn't mean it in the sense that we appreciate it today, of being able to control the destinies of everybody else. What he meant was being an emulatable model for the rest of this world, for the rest of mankind, a sustainable process of development. The third is compassion. Without compassion, human progress is never going to happen. So an Indian model of development will be something which is compassionate, driven by a sense of equity, driven by the fact that dignity in life is something which is not negotiable, and we are all going to be together in this long haul in the years to come. What is the kind of vision that this can create? This can create an India where, again in Swami Vivekananda's words, he said, Indian progress cannot be by a revolution, it has to be by an evolution. He said it so beautifully. He said, it's not by pulling down the rich, but by pushing up the poor that can India arise. Now that is the kind of equity we need to have. We cannot grumble and grudge about the fact that 40% of the Indian GDP is controlled by mere 40 Indian families. Well, that's a fact. But how do we look at the rest of the 1.25 billion people and get them to climb the socio-economic ladder in the way I have defined development till now? That is the India that we need to create, and it is not an undoable experiment. Our kings in the past, the structures that we had, Chanakya and his different descriptions in Arthashastra have all led us to that kind of a thinking. What we need is, more importantly, faith in our own selves. We are all in a situation in this world today where we believe anything Indian, anything traditional may not be good enough. I am not saying we got to blindly believe in it. Let's be empirical. Let's ask the evidence for all this. But let's appreciate there is enough evidence to show that everything old need not be discarded. There is so much that has to be kept. So we as young people with the highest demographic dividend any country can have. Just look at the situation that we have. Between 15 years and 55 years, a country whose productive population is the highest, 60% of Indians are in that category today. So 60% of Indians are in a situation, a unique advantage of giving their maximum to this country. And if this country's population is not given an opportunity to express themselves, look at the restlessness we can cause. Look around us. 1 in 3 districts of India is having a social problem, it's having a social unrest problem, where there is a set of people who believe that violence is a solution for everything that we are seeing around us. Violence is the only way you can bring in equity. Now if that has to change, if that has to be redefined, we got to relook at development itself and make sure that we are able to bring in equity not with a gun, but this appreciation of development. So we need to create an India which goes beyond the traditional caste structures. We need to create an India which goes beyond the typical class structures. We need to create an India which goes beyond division based on sex or gender. Create an India which we can be proud about. But remembering what Vivekananda said, he said in India, everything is done based on the religious platform. He said if you really understand religion as a personal lifestyle, a personal mission statement, we need to integrate our development also on the same foundational principles, where religion to me is not a very narrow understanding of Hinduism, Christianity or Islam. It is something very intensely personal, a way of life which is dharmic, which follows the principles of humanity itself. And if our development is based on that, it has to be sustainable, it has to be contextually relevant, it has to be culturally appropriate. I would like to end my narration with a small example I had, a small experience I had, an anecdote which happened to me many years ago. I had gone into this tribal area. I had this dream in my eyes, I can change this country. And at that point of time, my vision of development was to give whatever I had experienced and enjoyed, and I thought that's my responsibility to give back to society, to members of society who were marginalized, who didn't have access to that. And one of the things was education, and I believe education changed my life. And here I was in the school looking at wanting to start education. I had 28 children, tribal children were coming to me, and two incidents I would like to narrate. I was running this small school in a cow shed that I had built, and 28 children would come there. And every afternoon I would run the clinic in the mornings, and in the afternoon I would teach these children classes after a meal. And one day I had a patient larger than normal, so I had to stay back in the hospital, and to keep the children occupied, I gave this 28 set of children a small task. I asked them to go around. We had a 5-acre campus. I asked them to go around and said, you got to pluck leaves from these trees. You can't pluck the same leaf twice. You can't have two similar looking leaves. You got to have leaves which are different. I said, count them. You learn numeracy and mathematics. Come back and explain about different kinds of leaves you collected. This young boy Manju, remember, he was a 7-year-old, and he comes back to me with 163 different kinds of leaves. And he talks about which leaf is from which tree, gives me the name of the tree, and also tells me which birds will nest in which tree in which season, and shows me one leaf from the tare tree, tare mara is what we call in Kannada, and says, never have honey from this tree. A 7-year-old, you don't believe him, you think, oh, he's just pulling a fast one. But later on, I did collect that honey and sent it to the CFTRI for a test in Mysore, and we found it had a neurotoxin. So the 7-year-old child knew that I should not take that honey. Now that is knowledge, that is traditional wisdom. And today, we go back to these children and teach them science and botany. Now this 7-year-old already knew what a PhD in botany would not know. So to me, there's a lot of foundational knowledge, like Vivekananda said, which is already inherent in man, in societies, in communities. Our challenge is to get it expressed, to get it manifested. The second example, that is something which is contextually relevant. We got to really understand it. And today what are we doing? We say skilling India, and we have tribals learning motor rewinding. Now I keep laughing at it. I live in an area where tribals neither have a fan nor a mixie, but I have 100 people trained in motor rewinding. I don't know what they're going to do with it. I'd rather teach them cell phone repair, because everybody's got a cell phone now. Because that's the only thing we are capable of teaching. We got to understand what is it that they need. The second story I would like to narrate is of Muddaya. For these same children, I wanted to build a school. The government had given me a piece of land. And when I decided to build the school, Muddaya and all the local tribals protested. And their protest was not because they didn't want a school, because I had got the traditional spirits invoked, and these Yajamanas who were traditional chieftains had told me school can be built. After they gave me the permission, I started wanting to build the school, and then the local Jainukurba, one of the anthropological tribes there, said that I can't build there. And the reason they gave was that was a traditional burial ground, and they said if you build a school there, the spirits living in that campus would get disturbed and they would create a lot of trouble. Their challenge was, they'll say, I would not even be alive to see the trouble, because I'll be the first one to be the sacrifice to these spirits, and then the children will never come to school. I was wondering, I want to enforce education, I want to build a school, so I wouldn't care about local people and customs. And I thought, what does it matter? I think this is the world of rationality that we live in, all the spirits is all bunkum. So I said, I'm going to go ahead. But the people would just not let me go ahead. So I was very confused. They said, you can build your school, but no child will come to school. And I knew the tribals. If they said no child would come, no child would come. So very confused, I was sitting with Muddaya, very elderly Yajamana, and he told me, well, what do you want? I said, I want a school. He said, do you believe a school can change people's lives? I said, I truly and sincerely believe it will help in changing their lives. Then he said, let's talk to the Yajamanas. Look at, we learn mediation, negotiation. You can't have a more tribal mediator than this. He told me, let's talk to all the chieftains. He called a meeting of all the local chieftains. And the chieftains told me, we want a school, but we can't allow it here because the spirits will be disturbed. And in the course of the conversation, the elderly chieftain told, we have a solution. The solution is, we'll ask the spirits for a solution. So they called the spirits, and the spirits came down on this medicine man, and it was fun. And the solution is very simple. He said the solution is, we can request the spirits to transplant. We'll just ask them to leave this place and go to another burial site. Now, it looks silly and jovial, but fact was, Muddaya handled it so beautifully. He told me, you should decide not to talk about your principles for the next 3 days if you want a school. And what are my principles? I was a strong anti-tobacco, anti-liquor campaigner. So he said, you can't talk of tobacco or liquor. You just have to, you just can't tell me what to do. I'll ensure that the community agrees to what the school getting built in that place. And what was the way of appropriating the spirits? He said, we'll call the spirits, and the best way to ask them to go to another place is to offer them a bribe. And the bribe was a chillum of tobacco and 2 packets of arak. So every major chieftain would come in and say, my tribe and all the spirits living here will go away. There are 60 spirits here, so 60 packets of arak and 60 packets of tobacco. So after distributing 1,000 rupees worth of arak and tobacco, all the spirits left. And today we have a school for the last 20-25 years. More than thousands of children have graduated. Many of them have become teachers. Many of them have become artists, and a lot of them are working in the forest department. Life has changed for them. To me, I give this example as context driven. If the context says, the culture says that this is the way I understand development, we have to learn to respect that culture. So development has to incorporate citizen participation. Development has to incorporate social accountability structures. Development has to accommodate decision making for the people whom development is happening. Development has to be based on empowering the citizens to negotiate the complexities of development itself, to build them to decide and appreciate what they want. That is really human progress. Development is not what the government sitting in Delhi decides or in Bangalore decides. It's not what an NGO wants to do. It's about asking people what to do, how to do it, and doing it together with them. That was what was India known for, and this is the culture that we've got to bring back, and this is the India that we have to aspire to build. Well, this is not the final and the absolute model, but there's one perspective of looking at it, and there's one thing which might work for India. Thank you.